Well, 2020 has now turned 21, and I'm not sure about you, but for some of you, I think you kind of like that, and for others of you, you're just not sure. Maybe you don't like that. But for me personally, a new year, I get excited about. I love New Year's. I think a new year is a great kind of transition. A new year is an exciting time for like new discoveries. A new year feels like new beginnings. There's a time to start over. And really, I love a new year because it feels like a catalyst for change, like something better. So I get excited about New Year's, and I'm not alone. A lot of people do, and that's why we have these things called New Year's resolutions. And in 2021, if you're curious, the top 7 New Year's resolutions are this right here. It's to exercise more, lose weight, get organized, learn a new skill or hobby, perhaps golf. Maybe not today because it's snowing, which is kind of wild to think about. But, live life to the fullest. Maybe do some base jumping if you're into that. That'll kind of spark it all up. Save more money, spend less money, spend more time with family and friends. And guys, here's the deal. I think that's a great list. And I desire that for you. For every single one of us, I hope that in 2021, like we get to the end of the year and these things are true of us, that we have spent less money and we have more money, and that our relationships with our family and those close to us are richer, that we feel like we're living life to the fullest. I really hope that's true for all of us. But I was thinking about these New Year's resolutions, and I thought to myself, what if we just took all of these away? Because those are very much like 2020 New Year's resolutions. They're very much like 2019, 2018, 2017, 2016, 2015. They're very similar. But 2021 is not similar. 2021 is such a unique year. And so I thought to myself, well, what if we just cleared the list? What if we just kind of thought about something that we could all do, regardless if you're a Christian or not, that every single one of us could do that could really make a difference this year? What if we could do something that could make a tangible difference to where in our daily lives that we could actually feel purpose and meaning in an everyday life? That's not me just saying it, but like for real, you felt it. You woke up and felt more purpose and more meaning. What if there was something we could all do together to see that reality happen? What if there was something we could do to experience more peace in life? With all the anxiety and all the stress and all the worry about tomorrow, next week, and what's going to happen, I mean, that's a real thing. But what if there was actually something you and I could do together, collectively, we could do that could allow us to experience some rest and peace? And again, genuine rest to where you could look back on 2021 and go, wow, I mean, I've wrestled with anxiety for a long time, but this year was a different year. What if there was something like that? And what if there was something that you and I could do that actually would set us free? And what I mean by that is actually set us free from the things of the past. Maybe that tragedy or maybe that difficulty you went through that has so defined so many of the things you feel and you look at today. Or maybe the decisions of the past that you've made, these choices in the past, and it feels like every day you're thinking about them and they take a lot of energy and you're like, man, I would just love to be free. What if there was something we could do to actually set us free from those things? And what if there was something we could do to help us love and listen to those we disagree with? Instead of posting more things on social media about our opinions and just adding to the noise and perpetuating the issues in our culture, what if we actually did something that allowed us to listen and learn from those we disagree with? And what if there was something that allowed us to get some understanding about the injustices we see? Like, where do these injustices come from? And what are these injustices all about? And what can you and I do to go make a difference and not a point and make the world a better place? What if there was actually one thing that all of us can do, regardless if you're a Christian or not, that could actually lead to that in life? Guys, I really think there is. I think there's something that every single one of us can do. And in 2021, what I'd love us to think about is to think more about Jesus. That we could get to the end of 2021 and look back and go, wow, I mean, this is a year, I thought more about Jesus. I got more clarity about Jesus. Like that we could look back and say, this is a year I thought more about Jesus than I've ever thought, and I discovered more about the life of Jesus. I learned more than I've ever understood before. Like there's more windows, more context, more epiphanies, more discoveries. And it's just been amazing. And what if we could get to the end of 2021 and look back and go, man, I learned so much and thought about Jesus this whole year, and it cleared up so much confusion. Maybe confusion about the things you were taught in Sunday school or taught in your church experience growing up. Or maybe clear up some confusion if you were taught under a different religion and you're like, that religion taught me this about Jesus. Maybe this is year to go. But then I started to think about Jesus and I discovered things that maybe that's not necessarily true. And what if there is something we can do, which is thinking more about Jesus this year, that we could look back and clear up the confusion that perhaps the church has caused or Christians? Because maybe you've seen Christians fly some flags with Jesus or post some hashtags with Jesus, and you're like, that creates a lot of confusion. In fact, that actually does the opposite. It doesn't compel me to want to go discover Jesus. It compels me to want to step away from Jesus because of the church and because of these Christians. What if there was something that we could all do this year, which is think more about Jesus, look back on 2021 and go, you know what? So much of that confusion was cleared up this year because I thought more about Jesus. Guys, I'm just telling you, I am utterly convinced to the core of who I am that if we're willing to do this, just this one thing, it is our way forward. If you're willing to do this, this is your way forward. And what I'm also convinced of is that the more you think about Jesus, the more Jesus will reveal himself to you. And the more that Jesus reveals himself to you, I'm utterly convinced, the more irresistible he will be to you. So guys, that's where we're going. We're kicking off this whole year. And we're going to start this new series called Nothing Else. And the reason why we titled it Nothing Else is because it's like this idea to go, what if we just took everything away and it's nothing else but Jesus? And guys, my desire over the next several weeks, my goal, my hope for all of us over the next several weeks is that we discover things we've never heard or learned or saw about the life of Jesus. That we clear up some of the confusion about the life of Jesus. My hope over the next several weeks is that you discover that the things you desire, like for real, you desire things in life, that those are accessible and available through Jesus. Not just because the preacher says it, because you read it in the Bible or some church or religious talk. It's real. Like it's real. And my hope is that you actually discover, like, wow, this is real in my life. And ultimately, what I'd love us to discover is that Christianity is not about not cussing. Christianity is not about not having impure thoughts. In fact, what I'd love us to discover together is that Christianity is not about not at all. It has nothing to do with not. That Christianity has been and should always be about one thing: Jesus. So who is Jesus? Who's Jesus? Well, guys, there's so many ways we could answer that question. I mean, there's so many, ways we could approach that. But one of the coolest things is that when you look at the stories of Jesus and you look at his interactions with people, we get such context and insight into who Jesus is. And today I want to look at an interaction Jesus had with a man named Zacchaeus. Now, Zacchaeus, I want to give you a little bit of a backdrop or a little bit of a background to Zacchaeus because it gives so much life to the story we're going to look at today. And Zacchaeus, if you were to think about him, he was a man who lived 2,000 years ago, and he lived in the city of Jericho. And if you're a geographic person, you like maps and all that stuff, think of Jerusalem, think just northeast of Jerusalem, just like a half a day's walk, not very far, just a few miles. And that's Jericho, next to a major city. And that's where Zacchaeus lived. And Zacchaeus, he had a massive reputation. And Zacchaeus was a hated man. Everybody in Jericho, and I don't think I'm being overly dramatic. I think everybody in Jericho, they hated him. They couldn't stand him. I mean, Zacchaeus, he was an outcast. Zacchaeus, he was not even close to being religious. And he was okay with that. He was like, I'm good not being religious. In fact, Zacchaeus, being a Jewish person, brought up in a Jewish school, worshiping a Jewish God, couldn't step foot, couldn't even put his toe on a Jewish stone inside the Jewish temple. He was kicked out of the temple. I mean, he was done. Like the temple's like, we want nothing to do with you and you're not welcome here. And Zacchaeus, he was the sinner of all sinners. I mean, you talk about sinners in the city of Jericho, everybody go, oh, I think Zacchaeus is at the top. I mean, that was him. But again, he didn't mind being a sinner. He didn't care. He's like, I don't care what you guys think about this. In fact, the reason why people hated Zacchaeus so much and he had such a bad reputation is because he was a tax collector. And Zacchaeus was not only a tax collector, but this is important. He was a chief tax collector, which means he had a whole army of tax collectors under him. And the reason why being a tax collector was not a good thing and that why you were so hated in the first century is because as a tax collector, you sided with the oppressive Roman government who was oppressing Israel and oppressing the nation of Israel, the people of Israel. And every time you would collect taxes from your Jewish brothers and sisters, you were empowering and enriching the nation to oppress you even more. And every time they saw Zacchaeus, they're like, you're empowering this nation to oppress my family, oppress my kids, oppress a future generation even more. Like, we hate you, Zacchaeus. But that wasn't the kicker. The kicker was this, is that a tax collector in the first century, after they fulfilled the quota of Rome, meaning Rome had a set amount of taxes you had to collect, and there was taxes everywhere, the way they lined their pockets is they could charge whatever tax rate they wanted. Now think about this. Like, they would make tax rates up on the fly. So imagine this in your life. Imagine this in everyday life today. Imagine today you go buy an expensive TV and you walk in and you're like, go to the cash register and you show up and they're like, hey, your tax rate today is going to be 25% on that TV. And you're like, what? And they're like, yeah, I got a big vacation coming up. I'm going to charge you 25%. And you're like, no way, not going to do that. I'm walking out. But imagine if you couldn't walk out because they had a state trooper on their right and their left and said, we're going to arrest you and put you in jail if you don't pay these taxes. Well, these tax collectors in the first century, they had Roman soldiers on their left and right. And whatever they made up on the fly, you had to pay or you go to jail. Now, there would be something inside of you if that happened to you every single day that you went to go purchase something or crossed a bridge or went to go use something and you were collecting taxes and they were just making them up on the fly, that would go, I can't stand you. In fact, you don't want to be honest, but you perhaps would say, I kind of hate you. Well, they hated tax collectors, and Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector. He was a traitor. He was a thief. He took money from old little ladies. And if you take money from old little ladies, you are a bad man, right? And that's Zacchaeus. But here's the thing. You got to think about. Zacchaeus didn't care. In fact, I think of Zacchaeus kind of like a gangster, you know? He's like, you hate me? Fine. You know, Zacchaeus probably walked around Jericho with a long flowing like fur coat, a couple ladies on each arm. He had a Bugatti chariot and a Rolls Royce chariot. He had a big house overlooking the city of Jericho, you know, with his infinity pool looking over a massive body of water called the Dead Sea. I mean, TMZ Jericho followed him everywhere he went. I mean, he was that kind of gangster. I mean, he was in pop culture. He was that guy, and he didn't care. And he was up on what was happening in Jerusalem, what was happening in Jericho, because he was that kind of guy. And he heard about this man named Jesus. And he heard the rumors that Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah. And again, he grew up in a Jewish education system, and he'd heard these old teachings about this guy, you know, that God would promise one day to send a Messiah. And then here's this guy claiming to be the Messiah. And then here's stories of miracles to validate the very claims this guy named Jesus is making. And then he gets word, because he was in with, you know, the in crowd, if you will, that this guy named Jesus is coming to Jericho. And he was like, I'm going to get in my Rolls Royce chariot, get my entourage, and I'm going to go find this guy Jesus. I want to check him out. So that's Zacchaeus, and that's where we pick up the story. And then look at what happens. So as Jesus made his way through the city, that's Jericho, Zacchaeus was eager to see Jesus. He kept trying to get a look at him, but the crowds around Jesus were massive, and that's an important point. Because if you were to read the Bible, and you read that the religious leaders called the Pharisees hated Jesus. They hated Jesus for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons they hated him because everywhere he went, he had the crowds. And if you had the crowds in the first century, you had the power and you had the authority. They wanted the power. They wanted the authority. They're the religious leaders, and they were jealous of Jesus, and they hated it that he had the massive crowds. Everywhere Jesus went, massive crowds. So these big crowds, easy to find Jesus. You know, Zacchaeus goes, and he was a very short man, which was a problem. And he couldn't see over the heads of the people. So he ran ahead of everyone, climbed up a blossoming fig tree so he could get a glimpse of Jesus as he passed by. So here you have Zacchaeus. I mean, he finds Jesus. He can't see him because he's a short fella. You know, he goes ahead, anticipates where Jesus is going, sees a tree, climbs to get a really good angle. I mean, they've never met before, him and Jesus. So he's like really anticipating, what's he going to do? How's he going to handle these whole crowds? What if a religious leader asks him a question? I mean, he's got a good vantage point. And what happens? Look at this. When Jesus got to that place, he looked up in the tree and said, Zacchaeus! They'd never met before. Zacchaeus, hurry on down, for I'm appointed to stay at your house today. In other words, imagine this scene. Massive crowd. He looks up, he sees Zacchaeus, he calls him by name. Come on down, I want to go hang out at your house. I want to go spend time with you. Now, here's something that's pretty amazing. You know, research says that one of the sweetest sounds to a human ear is to actually hear your name. When somebody says your name, that's like, there's something that kind of lights up inside of you. And that's true for us, but technically it's not really true for me because my name is not Buck. I mean, you guys know me as Buck, but that's really a nickname. My legal name on my birth certificate is Justin Bo Giebelhaus. But the thing is, I've never been called Justin by my parents, ever. In fact, when I was born, came out of the womb, my parents looked at me, wrote that on the birth certificate, but they called me Buckwheat. Remember the Little Rascals, Buckwheat from the Little Rascals? Now, don't think about that too long because it really doesn't make sense, but my parents were hippies, smoked way too much. But they called me Buckwheat when I came out, and they had always called me Buckwheat. That's always been my name. My friends call me Buckwheat. The only person on the planet who calls me Justin is my Aunt Kathy. That's it. Until I was 12 years old. Because when I was 12, I went to middle school, felt like I was something. You know, at 12, I had a whole life figured out. And so I shortened my name from Buckwheat to Buck. And it's been Buck ever since. No one's ever called me Justin. So if you call me Buck, it lights me up. If you call me Justin, I'm like, that's weird, right? But the research says that one of the sweetest things to our ears is to hear our name. Now imagine this. Here's Zacchaeus. He's a thief. He takes money from old little ladies. He's a sinner of sinners. And of all people, Jesus stops, massive crowd, and goes, Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus. Man, I want to hang out at your house. Can you imagine that moment? So what happens? Well, they continue. So he scurried down to the tree and came face to face with Jesus. As Jesus left to go to Zacchaeus' house, many in the crowd complained, and I bet they did. Here's what they complained about. They said, look at this. Of all the people to have dinner with, Jesus is going to eat in the house of a crook. Other translations would say, he's going to eat in the house of a sinner of all sinners. Like, oh my gosh. Now, here's what's really cool about Jesus. If you look at the life of Jesus and you're asking the question, who is Jesus? I mean, Jesus would go from place to place, town to town, and he was notorious to go pick the worst of the worst sinner in the town and go spend time with that person. I think there's a reason behind that. But as a result of his decisions and his choices, those were solely his choices to do that, he developed a nickname as well. And everywhere he went, there was a nickname for Jesus. People would look at him and go, nickname, nickname, and here's what they would call him. Friend of sinners. Oh, there's the friend of sinners. There's the friend of sinners. Everywhere you go, oh yeah, you know what we know, but that's, people call him friend of sinners. Because everywhere he went, he befriended the sinners of the sinners. Now, if we pause right here for just a second, there's an implication to your life and to my life as a result of who Jesus is. And the implication is this, is you don't have to be good to be Jesus' friend. You don't. You just have to be honest. You have to be honest. And when I say honest, here's what I mean by that. It's that idea that if you allowed everything to be stripped away, like honestly, all your titles, all your likes on social media, all your status, all your bank account, and all the money and all that kind of, if you just stripped all that away, nothing's wrong with all those things. I'm just saying, if you stripped all of that away and you were just raw before Jesus, who are you? What choices have you made? See, that's just being brutally honest before Jesus. I'm telling you, he loves it. He loves it. And you begin to draw very close to him, and he begins to draw very close to you when you're honest. But the problem that keeps us from being honest is that we love to compare. And I'm part of this with you guys. I mean, when we see people and see the choices they make, we begin to make categories of sin. We go, oh, that's a little sin, that's a medium sin, that's a large sin, extra large sin, supersized sin. And then when we start categorizing sins, we begin to categorize people and go, oh man, did you hear about her? I mean, she's on her 5th marriage and it's not working out. And I think she's dating somebody. I mean, can you believe that? Oh man, she is such a terrible person. I mean, I don't know if God would actually be happy with her. Or we think, say things like this. Did you hear about that pastor? Oh my gosh, can you believe he did that? I mean, is he even a Christian? Oh my God. And we begin to put people in categories, sin in categories. And let me just say, please don't do that. It confuses the heck out of you when it comes to Jesus and when it comes to God and when it comes to Christianity. God did not do that. Jesus did not do that. And there's so many problems with doing that, but one of the major problems is it keeps you from being honest with you. Because there's always somebody who's done something worse than you. So when it comes to honesty, well, I could be, but I mean, look at him, look at her, look at them. There's somebody always worse. And it keeps us from being brutally honest, which keeps us from receiving those things that I talk about, those things perhaps you've heard about Christianity, grace and rest and freedom. You're like, those are all concepts. Those don't make a lot of sense to me. I wish I could experience those. Perhaps the reason you don't is because of honesty. Jesus draws close to those who are honest. And guys, let me just go first. And I've always tried to be very honest with you guys and transparent. Listen, I am in desperate need of Jesus. When I think about me, and I think about my current state, I think about my patience level and some of the impatience I have and some of the things I say and do to my boys because I'm not being patient. That's my reality today. I struggle with that almost every day. When I think about what's inside of me and some of my thoughts and some of the things that come out of my thoughts that I say to Jill that are so hurtful to her, I'm like, I know better than that. That is current. That happens today. When I think about some of my thought life, I'm like, oh man, I'm a preacher. I'm not supposed to have those kind of thoughts. When I think about people who do wrong to me and I'm supposed to do what love requires of me and pay them back, and bless them, I'm like, I don't want to do that. I just want to do evil for evil. They hurt me, I'm going to hurt them. All of that is so inside of me. In fact, just last night, I was working on my car with my boys and things weren't going well and I just lost it. And I raised my voice with Sam and Timbo and I was sitting there going, what am I doing? And like 5 minutes later, I looked at him and I just said, Sam and Timbo, can you guys come over here? Listen, that had nothing to do with you. I just lost it. That's my brokenness. That's my impatience. And that had nothing to do with you. That had everything to do with my brokenness. You see, I'll go first. I am in desperate need of Jesus Christ. And that kind of honesty is a requirement. And I'm telling you, the truth is, if we stripped everything away, regardless if you're a prostitute or if you're a pastor, we all sit at the same table. And the table is a table of sinners. And we're all in desperate need of Jesus. And the good news is this, is that Jesus befriends sinners, which means Jesus befriends me and Jesus befriends you. And Zacchaeus was beginning to discover this. He's leaning into this going, wow, I just didn't know this. I was confused about who Jesus was. And the conversation or the story continues. It says, Zacchaeus joyously welcomed Jesus and was amazed. That word amazed literally means shocked, like, wow. I was amazed over his gracious visit to his home. And imagine this. As we think about this story, we don't know how long Jesus spent at Zacchaeus' home. The narrative doesn't tell us. He probably spent 2 to 4 hours according to some Jewish customs. We don't know what the conversation was like. We don't know what they talked about. We just know that Jesus went to his home, and we know from other stories about Jesus that Jesus was most likely curious about him, that Jesus listened to Zacchaeus, and perhaps Zacchaeus, for the first time in his life, was like, man, somebody's actually listening to me and cares about me. My employees listen to me, but they listen because they need a paycheck. But this guy, his compassionate eyes, his questions, his curiosity, he's actually curious about me. Imagine that moment. And as you imagine that moment, you would also imagine this, that Zacchaeus has got to be sitting there. He's sitting in his home, bought with money paid for by sin, right? This whole massive house, his infinity pool, his Bugatti chariot. The ladies all around, the people around the table, they're all just the massive sinners. And the food that Jesus puts in his mouth, all paid for with sin. Sin is everywhere. And Zacchaeus is going, does Jesus know this? Does he realize that the very food he's eating is bought for by all this money that came from such sinful behavior? And I promise it dawned on Zacchaeus. Of course he does. Of course he does. And he doesn't reject me. In fact, he calls me by name. And it had to dawn on Zacchaeus. Oh my gosh, I'm the least likely person in all of Jericho for Jesus to pick. But he stopped, looked at me, and he chose me. And of course, he would be amazed and shocked at the grace, unmerited favor of Jesus towards him. The whole thing wraps up this way. As a result, Zacchaeus stood in front of the Lord and said, "Half of all that I own, I will give to the poor. And Lord, if I have cheated anyone," which he knew he did, "I promise to pay back 4 times as much as I stole," because he realizes he was a thief. Jesus hears these words and he responds this way: "This shows that today life that you desire, life has come to you and your household, Zacchaeus, for you are a true son of Abraham." And then Jesus gives us his purpose statement, why he came into the world. The Son of Man, that's Jesus, the Son of Man has come to seek out and to give life to those who are lost. You see, there's a huge implication for the church right here. The church is supposed to be the body of Christ. In fact, what's known of Jesus should be known of the church, which means the fundamental thrust of every church, the thing at the core, the thing that should drive every conversation, is we are here to seek and to save those that are lost, to introduce them to who Jesus really is. And so here you have this guy, Zacchaeus, hardened, callous, thief, traitor, sinner of sinners. And listen to this: willing to go broke, literally financially broke for Jesus. And it didn't matter to him. And if you and I were in that room and we heard Zacchaeus do this and we're watching him go broke, like for Jesus, we would all go, "What happened? How do you explain that? That's not even quantifiable." None of us in our wildest dreams would ever anticipate Zacchaeus would have that radical kind of change in his life. So what happened? Well, Zacchaeus' heart changed. I mean, that's clear. And the question is, what changed his heart? What created that heart change? Well, think about it. Was it some sort of religious activity? Did he go to the temple and start adhering to the religious systems of the day and going through the cleaning process and saying unclean, unclean, unclean 3 times and going through all the ceremonial washings to get clean and right with the Jewish God? Did he stop cussing? Did he stop womanizing? Did he stop thieving? I mean, all those things are wonderful. I mean, they just make life, more complicated if you don't. But I mean, is that what created this life change, this heart change? No. Those were simply all outcomes. You know what created a heart change in the life of Zacchaeus? He came face to face, spent time with Jesus, thought about Jesus, cleared up the confusion he had about Jesus, discovered amazing things about Jesus, and it changed him from the inside out. In fact, I think if Zacchaeus was here today, I think this is what he would say to you and to me. He would say, "This is what happened to me." He would go, "I discovered at the deepest levels of my soul that I'm deeply loved by Jesus Christ, and I've done nothing to earn it or deserve it." I think Zacchaeus, if he was here today, he would say, "Man, I experienced the unconditional love of Jesus. I experienced the amazing grace," you've heard that said, amazing grace of Jesus. And I think Zacchaeus would look at you and me, look us straight in the eyes and said, "And guys, it wasn't a concept." I think Zacchaeus would say, for so long, for so many years, I would hear like the priest and I would hear the religious text talks about the unconditional love and the amazing grace that's going to change your life. And I'd be like, yeah, it's just a concept. As long as it's a concept, it's not going to change your life. What happened for Zacchaeus, he would say to you and to me, he'd go, "Oh, it became personal. I stood face to face. It was personal, the grace. It was personal, the unconditional love. And it changed me from the inside out." So, as we think about all of that and go back to what we can do this year to make a difference in our lives and make a difference around us, our goal of thinking more about Jesus. I think the truth is, as we think about this, I think the truth is we all have a little Zacchaeus inside of us. No pun intended. But I think we do. We have a little Zacchaeus in us that keeps us from actually experiencing and actually doing this. And so what I want to do is I want to ask 3 questions. And I want you personally to think about these questions, like personally, because this will help us be more curious. This will help us take a step and discover the very thing we desire in life. And so here's the question. I want you to think about this. Is Jesus for you, is Jesus more irresistible today than yesterday? And regardless if you're a Christian or not, I want you to answer this question. For you, is Jesus more irresistible today than he was last week, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? And if you're a Christian, I want you to think about this, and I want you to be honest. Honesty is required. And if you're honest and you're like, I don't know. Today when I hear Jesus, it feels a little bit abstract. Today when I hear Jesus, I'm like, so what? There's a little bit of apathy inside of you. Can I just poke on you a little bit and ask you why? Why? Why is it hard to spend time with him? Why is it when maybe I put this up on the screen, you were like, whatever. What is that? Where did that come from? See, I think in 2021, you owe it to yourself as a follower of Jesus to answer that question, to think about Jesus and understand why he's less irresistible today than he was yesterday. And if you're not a follower of Jesus and Jesus seems to be resistible to you, I would ask you the same question, why? Just be honest, why? Why is Jesus resistible and why is he not irresistible and a person that you would actually decide to put your trust and confidence in? And I think if you're not a follower of Jesus Christ, you owe it to yourself. You do in 2021 to get to the bottom of that. And maybe to think more about Jesus and maybe clear up the confusion that the church or that pastor or that priest or that religious leader or what's on social media has created for you. And just get to the bottom of it and go, okay, why is Jesus resistible to me? I think you deserve it to answer that question. Second question. What is your motivation to do good things? And again, this is for you if you're a Christian or not a Christian. What is your motivation to serve, to give, to love, to not say those things that you want to say? You put that filter and go, okay, I'm going to do what love requires of me. What is your motivation as a Christian to do this? And as a Christian, if your motivation is to go, well, the reason I do this is because I want God to look at me and I want God to kind of go, oh, I'm proud of you, kiddo. Way to go. Man, I see you. Great job. If that's you and that's your motivation to do good things as a follower of Jesus Christ, can I just say perhaps you're confused about Jesus? Because Jesus going, I'm proud of you. Jesus going, you're my kiddo. Jesus going, you're my gal. You're my boy. Jesus doing that has nothing to do with you. Let me just ask you a question. Why did Jesus stop and look at Zacchaeus and say, hey, Zacchaeus, come on, I want to spend time with you? Was it because of all his religious activity? No, not even close. It's because of Jesus' mercy, his grace, his choice. Jesus makes the same choice with you. And when we get clarity on that and get back to the fact that I am accepted, I have value and worth, I'm forgiven through Jesus Christ, that then compels us to go, okay, it's personal now. Whatever you ask, I'm in. I'm in. And that's our motivation. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, same question. What motivates you to do what you do? What motivates you as you define good to try to do good things? Perhaps one of your motivations when it comes to religion, when it comes to God, is if there's a God up there, you kind of go, well, I just hope, my good outweighs my bad. But I really want to challenge that. How do you quantify that? If you do one bad thing, is that like a 1.2 and you do one good thing, that's like a 2.3? How do you actually quantify and how do you get to the bottom of how good is good enough? If you stand before the pearly gates and there's old St. Peter and God and everything is raw and everything's stripped away and you got to give an account and your good has to outweigh your bad, how do you actually know where you stand with God? See, I would contend and put forth that is an exhausting, bankrupt system that will cause you to walk away from Jesus and walk away from Christianity. At least I would. I wouldn't want that kind of system. That's exhausting. You never know where you stand with God. What if Jesus is right? What if he looks at you, knows you by name, and is inviting you to something you so desire so that you know where you stand with God? And every day of your life, you can know you have value, purpose, meaning, and that your eternity is secure. I think you owe it to yourself to get to the bottom of that. Last of all, as we wrap up, do you feel hopeless or helpless? Is there something inside of you that goes because of what happened in the past? maybe sins and you go, well, I've just sinned too much. I don't think God could forgive me. Or maybe because your mom, maybe because your dad, maybe because that religious leader keeps poking at you and said, well, because of that decision you made, because of that sin you did, I don't know if you have a chance with God. Do you feel hopeless and helpless when it comes to having peace with God, or even when it comes to the outlook of tomorrow? If so, perhaps it's because you're listening to the wrong voice. Perhaps it's because of confusion. And my desire for you in 2021 is just to think more about Jesus, get clarity about him, and maybe begin to discover that when it comes to Jesus, Jesus, he is not your accuser. Jesus is not your prosecutor. Jesus is not your judge. Do you know who Jesus is? Jesus is your friend and your rescuer. Jesus is a friend of sinners. And do you know what the good news is? This is why Jesus came into the world. That the good news is that Jesus came to reveal a God who defines us not by our actions, but by his unconditional love, by grace, unmerited favor, and he's offering it to you. You see, God doesn't define you and call you by your sin. He doesn't call you by your choices. Do you know what God calls you? He calls you by your name. And my hope for you, my desire for all of us, is that 2021 would be the year that we clear the clutter, that we stop listening to all the voices that push us down, that weigh us down, that confuse the heck out of us when it comes to Jesus, and that you discover Jesus for who he really is. Because I'm convinced of this. The more you think about Jesus, the more Jesus, he will reveal himself to you. And the more Jesus reveals himself to you, the more irresistible he will become. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you so much for this day, for this moment, for this time that we could just have these conversations like this. And Father, I'm so grateful for the preservation of stories about the life of your son, Jesus. And Jesus, I'm so grateful that you befriended sinners like me. I'm so grateful that that's who you are. I'm so grateful for your grace. I'm so grateful for your unconditional love. I'm so grateful that in spite of what I have or have not done, that I have incredible value. We have incredible value in your eyes. Father, I just pray for all of us that whatever it looks like for us to take a step in 2021 and be intentional to think about you more, whatever that is. God, would you compel us? Would you motivate us? Would you convict us where we need to be convicted and allow us to think more about Jesus Christ? I think he's a game changer. And God, that's my request to you, and I trust you with that. In Jesus' name, amen.